She put a coin on this table. That is where this story begins. Not with the three men who walked through the door, not with the silence that followed, not with the 17 seconds that changed everything inside that restaurant on a Tuesday night in October. It begins with a coin, a silver challenge coin, worn smooth at the edges from years of being held and turned and set down in quiet places. The kind of coin that means nothing to a stranger and everything to the person carrying it. She placed it on the white tablecloth at booth S3 in the corner of Ashford Grill in Clearwater, Idaho, the way some people set a photograph on a nightstand before they sleep. Carefully, deliberately, like a small prayer no one else was meant to hear. Her name was Mara Cole. She was 40 years old, and she had spent the last 14 of those years doing things for this country that will never appear in any newspaper. Things that happened in places most Americans cannot find on a map. Things that required a specific kind of person. Not brave in the way people imagine bravery. Not fearless. Something quieter and colder and harder to explain at a dinner table. She had signed her demobilization papers that morning at 8:43. 14 years, 6 deployments, 1 Echelon Medal, and a classified service record that the government would spend another 30 years deciding what to do with. She had walked out of the processing office into a gray Idaho morning, stood on the sidewalk without moving for a long moment, and then driven to her apartment and sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes because she did not know what a person was supposed to do next. What she eventually did was put on a green dress and drive to Ashford Grill. I want you to understand something before we go any further. What happened in that restaurant over the course of 47 minutes will be replayed on phones and televisions and news broadcasts more times than anyone could count. People will call it incredible, shocking. Those are easy words. They let you stay at a comfortable distance from the truth. They let you watch without really seeing. What actually happened inside Ashford Grill on that Tuesday night was something older and more human than 17 seconds of footage. It was a woman at the end of one life trying to figure out how to begin another. It was a drunk man who had never been told no by anyone who mattered. It was a father at the next table making the kind of decision that most people spend their whole lives finding reasons to avoid. And it was a coin, silver, worn smooth at the edges. That coin is how we are going to understand everything else. Ashford Grill sat on the eastern edge of downtown Clearwater, the kind of restaurant that had been there long enough to feel permanent. Dark wood paneling, lighting low enough to make everything look considered. White tablecloths changed between every seating. A jazz trio played Wednesday and Friday sets, but this was a Tuesday, so recorded music moved through speakers hidden in the ceiling, and the bass touched the floor just enough to feel if you were paying attention. The steaks were dry-aged. The cheapest bottle of wine cost more than a car payment. The hostess had worked there 6 years and knew every regular by name, knew which tables they preferred, knew which ones needed to be seated away from each other because of old arguments or older histories. She placed Mara Cole at booth S3 because Mara Cole had called ahead and requested it specifically. Booth S3 was a half-moon corner seat, deep burgundy upholstery. The booth sat at an angle that gave a clear line of sight to both the front entrance and the hallway leading to the kitchen exit. The mirror on the wall beside it, if you knew how to use it, reflected a clean view of the bar and the secondary entrance near the coat check. Mara Cole had not known this restaurant before today. She had found it 3 hours earlier after sitting in her apartment parking lot, in her apartment some more when she had finally opened her laptop and typed the name of the town she had chosen to live in and the words "quiet dinner alone." She had looked at the menu. She had studied the layout on the restaurant's website. She had called to request booth S3. Old habits do not die. They simply learn to wear civilian clothes. She arrived at 8:47, 8 minutes after the restaurant had filled to comfortable capacity. The green dress was not a choice she had thought carefully about. It was the first thing she touched in the closet that did not belong to a uniform. She carried a matte black bag over her left shoulder, the strap adjusted to a length she had used for years, the bag itself positioned at what someone watching might have thought was a careless angle. It was not careless. It was 2 o'clock. Clean access, the hostess led her to booth S3. Mara sat with her back to the wall. She placed the bag at her right side handle, looped once positioned where her hand would fall naturally. She looked at the menu without reading it. She was reading the room. Table of 4, business dinner. 2 men in their 50s, 2 women in their 40s. Low probability of anything. A family near the window, 2 children, under 10, a grandmother who kept reaching across to cut food she had not been asked to cut. The father looked tired in the patient way of a man who had learned to absorb small things without letting them accumulate into large ones. That was Ray Kowalski, though Mara did not know his name yet. She filed him as father attentive, no threat, the kind of man who paid attention to what was happening around him, because parenting had taught him that the moment you stopped was the moment something went wrong. The bar held 6 people, 3 alone, 2 together and unhappy about it, 1 alone with a book who was happy about it in a way that required no company to confirm. Mara ordered a glass of Cabernet. She did not open the menu again. She placed the challenge coin on the table. The sound it made was one no one around her could have heard, a small, precise sound. The sound of a decision she had made every time she sat down alone anywhere since the Voularor Highlands 9 years ago. Garrett Wren had pressed it into her palm on the morning of the operation, standing outside the forward operating base in the mountain dark, his breath fogging in the cold. And he had said exactly what soldiers say when they give each other things they are not sure they will be able to take back. He had said, "Hold on to that for me." She had held on to it. Through 3 more deployments and a dozen operations, and the kind of sleep that was really just waiting to wake up. Every time she sat down alone to eat, she placed it on the table across from the empty chair, and she did not examine why, and she never explained it to anyone, and she never would. The waiter arrived, young, attentive, wearing his uniform with the slightly self-conscious pride of someone who took the job seriously and was still learning not to show it. He had a notepad and a genuine smile, and he did not stare at the coin on the table, which Mara noticed and appreciated without comment. She ordered pot roast. It was not what she would have chosen for herself. Mara Cole ate for function. Protein, efficiency, predictability. She had spent 14 years in environments where food was fuel and nothing else, and that habit did not dissolve with a morning of paperwork. Left to herself, she would have ordered the salmon. But Garrett Wren had talked about pot roast the way some men talked about home. He had grown up in rural Pennsylvania, a small town where people kept their doors unlocked and their opinions loud and their pot roast on the stove every Sunday without variation. He had described his mother's recipe in specific detail during 3 separate operations at 3 different altitudes, usually when the situation had stabilized enough for men to talk, but not enough for anyone to relax. When he got home, he had said the first restaurant meal he was going to order was pot roast, because restaurant pot roast was different from home pot roast, and he wanted to know which one he actually missed. He never got home. So Mara Cole ordered the pot roast. She did not think of it as tribute. She did not think of it as grief. She had learned long ago that some things did not require a name to be real. The waiter brought bread. The jazz recording shifted to something slower. The family near the window erupted briefly into a small argument about whether the youngest child had eaten enough vegetables. The grandmother won. The child ate the vegetables with the expression of someone signing a document under duress. Mara watched all of it in her peripheral vision without moving her head. 8:52. That was when they walked in. She felt them before the door had fully opened. Not instinct in any mystical sense. It was information arriving through channels that 14 years had opened and kept open regardless of what the paperwork said. The sound of the door, the weight of it opening, 3 people moving through at once in a pattern that was not considerate of the space around them. The volume of their arrival. The way the hostess near the entrance straightened almost imperceptibly, the small adjustment a person makes when something requires more management than expected. Mara took a slow sip of wine. She used the curve of the glass to watch their approach. 3 men, late 30s to early 40s. The largest one was 6'3" broad through the shoulders, wearing a jacket that had been expensive once, and was now carrying the evidence of a long day of celebrating. He moved through the room like someone who had spent his whole life being the biggest person in it, which meant he moved like someone who had never once had to think carefully about his size. That was Brett Langdon. She did not know his name yet. She filed him as the center drunk, entitled the type who interpreted any resistance as a personal challenge, because nothing in his life had ever made resistance feel like more than a temporary inconvenience. The one to his right was shorter, harder through the jaw, with the coiled readiness of a man who had learned to compensate for lesser size with greater speed. He was the one Mara noted first, which seemed counterintuitive given Brett's size, but instinct refined through 6 deployments was rarely counterintuitive. That was Derek Solt. She filed him as the striker faster than he looked, the one who would move second and hit hardest. The third one trailed slightly behind with the look of a man who was not entirely sure he wanted to be where he was, but had not yet located the nerve to be anywhere else. Nervous energy in his hands. A laugh that came a beat too late and landed a note too loud. That was Marcus Webb. She filed him as uncertain, the most unpredictable variable in the group. They had been drinking since before noon. She could see it in the way Brett carried his weight forward of his center, The looseness that comes from a long day celebrating something that is not worth celebrating but feels worth celebrating because someone handed it to you and told you it was. He had been given a promotion. She would learn this later. The hostess tried to seat them near the back. Brett Langdon was not interested in the back. His gaze moved across the room with the slow proprietary sweep of a man who believed any room he entered was his by virtue of his presence in it. The sweep stopped at booth S3. Mara did not look away. She did not adjust her posture. She took another measured sip of wine and set the glass down with the same deliberate care she had used to place the coin, and she thought incoming. Not fear. Fear was a different animal, one she had met properly in the Vularor Highlands and several other places and had made a working peace with. What moved through her now was data, threat assessment, target identification, environmental mapping. The family to her left, the business dinner to her right, the exits. The weight of the bag at 2 o'clock, the geometry of the room and what it permitted. De-escalation, she told herself. Option 1. Always option 1. This was not the Vularor Highlands. There were no rooftops, no embedded positions, no threats already classified by the laws of armed conflict. There were white tablecloths and candlelight and a jazz recording and a coin on the table. She was a civilian now. The paperwork said so. She was going to be a civilian the way she was going to be everything else she planned to become, which was one decision at a time, starting with the one directly in front of her. Brett Langdon crossed the dining room like he owned the floor. His companions followed because that was what they did. He stopped at booth S3. He spread his arms in a loose, expansive gesture meant to fill space, and it did. Well, he said. The word carried the particular pleasure of a man who had made a decision before he opened his mouth. Look at this. Mara looked up. Her expression was neutral, her eyes gray and clear and completely steady. And if Brett Langdon had been paying the kind of attention his circumstances required, he would have noticed that those eyes did not move, the way most people's eyes moved when they were surprised or uncomfortable or trying to manage a situation. They did not move at all. Good evening, she said. Her voice was level and deliberate, each word placed. I'm just having a quiet dinner. I'm sure your server can find you a wonderful table. Brett smiled. The smile reached the performance of his eyes, but not the intention behind them. He slid into the booth across from her. You look lonely, he said. She did not look lonely. She was alone, which was a different thing entirely. And she had been alone in ways that Brett Langdon's imagination could not have accessed on its most creative day, and none of it had ever looked like loneliness. Derek Solt and Marcus Webb arranged themselves around the table. Not sitting, flanking. The positioning was not casual. I appreciate the thought, Mara said, but I prefer to eat alone. I'm sure your server can get you settled. She prefers to eat alone. Brett said it to his companions, not to her. That small grammatical shift, the move from you to she while she was sitting right there, was its own kind of statement. The father at the adjacent table, Ray Kowalski, had stopped cutting his children's food. His wife's hand found his arm. Mara set her wine glass down. She reached for the edge of the table, steadying herself. Not because she needed steadying, but because the gesture communicated something resolved and calm, and she wanted the communication to be clear. There's been a misunderstanding, she said. I'll settle my check, and you can have the table. She began to reach for her bag. Brett Langdon's hand came across the table. His fingers closed around her wrist. He squeezed, knuckles whitening, enough pressure to bruise. The kind of grip that is not an accident and not a miscommunication, and not anything other than exactly what it plainly is. You're not going anywhere, he said, until we say you can go. The dining room continued for one more beat in its ordinary life. Silver against china. Conversation. The music through the ceiling speakers. And then that beat ended and something changed in the room without anyone being able to say what changed. And the conversation slowed and the silverware went still. Ray Kowalski stood up. He was not a large man. He was not trained in any meaningful sense. He was a man in his mid-40s in a plaid shirt who had come out on a Tuesday night with his wife and children and his mother-in-law, who had probably argued mildly about dessert and helped someone with a menu and done all the small, ordinary things that ordinary evenings were made of. He stood up because someone needed to, and he was the someone who happened to be there. He stood up frightened, which was visible in the set of his shoulders, in the quality of his breathing. He stood up frightened, and he stood up anyway, which is the only form of courage that has ever actually counted. Let her go, he said, before this gets worse. Brett turned slowly. The slowness itself was a kind of contempt. What exactly are you going to do, friend? Ray Kowalski did not blink. Whatever I have to. Derek Solt moved first. He shoved Ray with a hard, flat-palmed force that sent Ray back into his chair, knocked it sideways. Ray grabbed the table edge. His wife made a sound. His children went silent in the way children go silent when the world suddenly shows them something they were not prepared to know. The restaurant gasped. A wine glass hit the floor somewhere near the bar. Mara moved. Not because protocol required it, not because the training said so. She moved because a decent man had stood up when nothing required it and had been punished for doing it, and that was a line that existed before the paperwork and would exist long after. Her chair slid back without a sound. Her hand came down on Brett Langdon's wrist with precise force and nerve press applied to a specific point. His fingers opened like a reflex because they had no other option. He made a sound that was not the sound of a man his size. Her elbow found Derek Solt's sternum in the same continuous motion, and Derek folded and went down hard, the air leaving him on impact with the carpet. Marcus Webb lunged, arms out, no plan, the way desperate and untrained people commit to something they cannot complete. She sidestepped. Her hand found the bread basket at the edge of the table. The dinner roll covered the distance to Marcus Webb's open mouth before he processed what was happening. He bit down by reflex. His momentum carried him past her. Her foot caught his ankle. He went down. The dinner roll bounced once from his forehead and came to rest in the shallow bowl of the nearest salad. Brett Langdon got to his feet. His face had passed through the performance of authority and arrived somewhere raw. He came forward with the committed energy of a large man who had run out of options and arrived at the only one remaining. She pivoted. She caught his arm at the apex of the swing, absorbed his momentum, redirected it in one smooth arc that used his own mass against the corner of the table. The impact was solid and final. He slumped sideways against the booth base and did not immediately get up. 17 seconds. She was not breathing hard. The restaurant had gone completely still. 40-some people across 14 tables, none of them moving silverware suspended halfway to mouths, wine glasses raised and not lowered, conversations stopped at their syllables. Near the bar, a baby made one exploratory clapping sound and then went quiet when no one joined in. Mara looked around the room and waited to confirm the situation was resolved. It was resolved. She reached into the booth. Her hand found the challenge coin on the white tablecloth. She picked it up the way you pick up something that belongs to you without looking at it, and she placed it in her bag. She straightened her dress. There was a small tear in the left sleeve, perhaps 2 inches. She examined it briefly and left it. From her bag, she took a folded $100 bill and placed it on the table beside the untouched pot roast. "I apologize for the disturbance," she said to the room. Her voice was even and clear. The same voice she had used to request booth S3 to order the pot roast, to ask Brett Langdon twice to find another table. These gentlemen appear to be experiencing a medical episode. Nobody laughed. Nobody moved. 40-some people sat with their phones pointed in her direction and watched her smooth the front of her green dress and reach for her bag. The front door opened. Detective Leon Carver was 53 years old and had spent 26 of those years working cases in Clearwater that required the kind of attention that did not switch off when the shift ended. He had come to Ashford Grill because his wife had made the reservation 3 weeks ago to celebrate a case closure he had finally achieved, and he was already tired, already thinking about the bourbon he intended to order, and none of that prepared him for what he walked into. He stopped. A trained eye finds the fixed points first. It establishes what has ended before it attempts to understand what preceded it. Leon Carver's eye found Brett Langdon slumped against the booth base with a nose swelling towards something geometrically wrong. It found Derek Solt on the floor in the posture of a man who had not chosen to be on the floor. It found Marcus Webb near the salad bar, still holding the dinner roll. Then it found Mara Cole, standing, still, not frightened, not distressed, not even particularly unsettled. The $100 bill on the table beside untouched food, the tear in the left sleeve, and those eyes gray and clear tracking him from the moment he came through the door with an attention that did not waver and did not perform itself. He pulled out his badge. "Detective Carver, can you tell me what happened here?" She glanced at the badge, then at him. Something in her expression made him straighten slightly without meaning to, a reflex he could not account for. "They approached my table uninvited," she said. "When I attempted to leave, they prevented me. The situation escalated when they became physical with another diner." Carver looked at Ray Kowalski sitting slightly dazed in his chair, with a cut on his palm from the table edge, his wife holding his hand, his children watching their father with the solemn, concentrated attention of people who are revising something they thought they understood. "I'll need to see some identification," Carver said. She reached into her bag and produced her license, handing it across with 2 fingers, the way you hand something to someone when you want them to take it and not misread the gesture. He read it. He looked up at her. He read it again. Something settled in his face in the pause between the second reading and his next breath, the quality of recognition landing differently than ordinary recognition. He took out his phone. He searched. He read. He looked up. Mara Cole, not quite a question. Voularor Highlands, the hostage operation. He looked at her with a different quality of attention, now careful and measured. You received the Echelon Medal. Her jaw moved slightly, the smallest adjustment. The first crack in the composure, or not a crack exactly, but a place where the composure became visible, which was its own kind of revelation. Former, she said, as of 8 hours ago. The room was still listening. Every person in it, the family near the window, at the business dinner, the people at the bar, the baby who had tried to clap. They were all listening and not one of them was moving. And outside the tall windows of Ashford Grill, the ordinary Tuesday night of Clearwater, Idaho, continued in full and comfortable ignorance of what had just happened inside. Leon Carver put his phone back in his pocket and took out his notepad. I'm going to need a full statement, he said. I know, she said, and they began. Leon Carver's notepad had 43 pages in it by the time he reached the precinct that night. He had not intended to use any of them. He sat in his car in the parking structure behind Ashford Grill with the engine off and the interior light on and read back through everything he had written, and then he read it again. Mara Cole had given her statement with the same quality of attention she had given the room when he first walked in. Complete, precise. No elaboration beyond what the question required, no deflection, no self-justification. She described the events in the order they occurred and used the language of someone who had spent years writing after-action reports and had not yet unlearned the habit. She identified Brett Langdon, Derek Solt, and Marcus Webb by physical descriptors she had noted during their approach to the host stand before any of them had said a word to her. She described Ray Kowalski's intervention and Derek Solt's physical response. She described her own actions with the same flat accuracy she applied to everything else without pride and without apology, the way a mechanic described a repair that had been necessary. When she was done, she asked if there was anything else he needed. He said he would be in touch if follow-up questions arose. She nodded and left. He watched her through the restaurant window, walking to her car. Green dress, matte black spray, the small tear at the left sleeve. She did not look back. Leon Carver had spent 26 years watching people leave rooms after difficult conversations and had formed opinions about what the different ways of leaving said about the person doing it. Most people, after something like what had happened in that restaurant, carried the residue of the event out with them. Their pace was wrong, corrected by adrenaline or deflated by it. Their shoulders held it. The event followed them through the door. Mara Cole walked to her car the way she had walked into the restaurant. Same quality of movement, as if the 17 seconds had been filed and closed and the filing cabinet put back in its place. He had seen that quality before, but rarely, and in specific people. And every time he had encountered it, he understood he was in the presence of something that had been built rather than born, something that had cost the person carrying it more than anyone on the outside could estimate. He started the engine and drove home. His wife had eaten by the time he arrived. She had left a plate in the oven and was reading in the living room when he came through the door. And she looked at him the way she looked when she already knew a conversation was coming. Tell me, she said. He told her. She listened completely without interrupting, without preparing her response while he was still talking. When he finished, she set her book down and looked at the window for a moment. She put the coin back in her bag, his wife said, after it was over, not before. Yes, she was keeping it safe. He had not thought about it in those terms. He thought about it now. He was still thinking about it when his phone went off at 5:40 the following morning with a call from dispatch telling him that a video from Ashford Grill had been viewed 2 million times overnight and his lieutenant wanted him in the office at 7. The video was 17 seconds long. Whoever had taken it had been sitting at the bar far enough back that the framing caught all of booth S3 and the tables around it close enough that the resolution held. The audio was compromised by ambient restaurant noise, but the action was perfectly legible. A woman in a green dress at a corner booth, 3 men around her table, the larger one's hand closing on her wrist, a man in plaid standing from the adjacent table, the shove, and then 17 seconds that required no narration. The clip had gone live at 11:43 the previous night. It had been shared 400 times by midnight. By 3 in the morning, it had passed 1 million views. By the time Carver walked into the precinct, it was past 4 million and climbing. The first upload had not come from the person at the bar. It had taken most of the morning to establish this because it seemed a minor detail and turned out not to be. The bar patron had posted their clip at 11:43, and it had circulated modestly. But 11 minutes before that, at 11:32, a different upload had already gone live. And it was that upload which had hit 1 million views first, which had been amplified by the accounts that reached millions, which had pushed the clip onto every major platform before midnight. The second upload had come from Ray Kowalski. He had posted it from his personal account with no hashtags, no algorithm, chasing no caption crafted for reach. 12 words. This woman stepped in when I couldn't. America should know her name. Ray Kowalski had been filming because his youngest daughter had said something funny at dinner, and he had wanted to be ready for the next funny thing she said. He had been holding his phone under the table, not quite recording, when Brett Langdon crossed the dining room toward booth 3. He had started filming, then the way people started filming things that looked like they were becoming something. He filmed all of it. When it was done and his wife was pressing a napkin to the cut on his hand, he had looked at what he had captured and posted it before he had thought carefully about what he was doing, because thinking carefully would have led him away from it. 12 words, 4 million views by 7 in the morning. By 9, the name Mara Cole was on every platform. By 10, a graphic had circulated matching the restaurant footage with a photograph from the Echelon Medal ceremony 9 years earlier. Dress uniform, that same quality of stillness that the green dress had not altered. By noon, cable news had found it, which meant it had found a shape. The shape was the one cable news was always seeking: a clean story with a clear protagonist and a ready-made set of villains. Woman alone, 3 men, outcome. The footage did the rest. By 2 in the afternoon, something else happened. The statement came from a public relations firm in Washington, D.C., the kind that answered its phones at all hours because the people it represented created the kind of situations that did not respect business hours. 3 paragraphs attributed to the office of Senator Warren Langdon of Idaho. The first paragraph expressed the senator's concern for public safety in light of the incident and his hope that a thorough investigation would follow. The second noted with regret that incidents of this nature were often more complicated than social media suggested. The third referenced, without direct quotation, a document described as an internal service record, indicating that the individual in question had been flagged during demobilization for what the statement called significant behavioral adjustment, concerns consistent with prolonged, high-stress service environments. It was not a direct accusation. Accusations were actionable. This was something else. A question left in a room for other people to find and repeat. The phrase high-risk behavioral discharge appeared in 4 news packages by 5 o'clock that afternoon. None of the outlets had seen the document. None had been given it. They had been given the phrase, which was all that was necessary, because a phrase placed in a headline develops its own independent existence, and whether the underlying document supports it becomes a secondary question that most viewers never reach. Leon Carver watched this unfold from his desk and felt the kind of anger he had learned over 26 years to keep completely off his face. Senator Warren Langdon was 61 years old, 3 terms in office, the kind of politician who had survived long enough to understand that survival required constant maintenance. His son, Brett, had been employed at a defense contracting firm bearing the family name since graduating from a university that also bore a significant family donation. The promotion Brett had been celebrating the previous evening had been noted in a trade publication 3 weeks earlier as a transition in senior leadership, which was how trade publications described the movement of people who had not earned what they were receiving. Leon Carver pulled up the files on the Vularoy Highlands operation. He had not worked that case. It was not his jurisdiction or his branch. But the name Mara Cole had stayed with him through the night in the way that names occasionally stayed, and so he had looked the way you looked at things when something told you to look. The Vularoy Highlands operation was 9 years old, a joint task force action in a theater that would take too long to explain. The official record was partial sections classified, but what was accessible told a coherent story. A successful operation by measurable standards. Objectives achieved. Minimum civilian impact. Sergeant First Class Garrett Wren had been listed as killed in action. The citation was formal and brief. He was 31 years old. 1 paragraph in an accessible supporting report described a delay in the extraction order. The language used was administrative, which was the language official reports used for things that had happened for reasons that were not yet convenient to explain. The delay was described as 40 minutes in duration, arising from what the report called a coordination gap at the command interface level. Carver stared at that phrase for a long time. Coordination gaps at command interface levels, in his experience, happened because someone somewhere had a different priority then the person on the ground, and the person on the ground was the one who paid for it. He closed the file. He sat in the stillness of a man who had found something he was not specifically looking for and was deciding what to do about it. Then he picked up his phone and called Mara Cole. She answered on the second ring. "There's a document I've been looking at," he said. "It's 9 years old and not easy to find, which is itself a kind of information. I'd like to show it to you in person if you're willing." "When?" she said. "This afternoon." "Send me the address," she said. She did not ask what the document was about. She already knew the shape of it. She had known the shape of it for 9 years. They met at a diner 7 blocks from the precinct. It had been there since the early 80s and looked it in the best possible way. Vinyl booths the color of old mustard, a counter with swivel stools, coffee arriving without being asked for in cups thick enough to survive dropping. The kind of place that had survived by being exactly what it was and never attempting to be anything else. Carver was already there when she arrived. A coffee and a manila folder and the look of a man who had not eaten since the previous day's lunch. He stood when she came through the door, and she was aware of it as a small, uncomplicated courtesy in a day that had not offered many. She sat, coffee arrived. He opened the folder. The document was a printed copy of an internal report, partially declassified sections blacked out in thick marker. Older paper, the quality of something that had been through a photocopier more than once. He turned it so she could read it. She read it. She read the paragraph describing the extraction delay. She read the phrase coordination gap at the command interface level. She read the notation below it, the one absent from most accessible versions of this report. Delay authorized by civilian office, then a section redacted. Then the words concurrent with Senate budget session, March 14th. March 14th was the date Garrett Wren died. She had not needed the document to know the date. She had known it for 9 years the way, dates that reorganize everything coming after them. But knowing the shape of a thing and seeing it written down in official language on an official document were two different weights, and she felt the difference now. She measured the space where the redaction sat, the black bar covering whatever name or office identifier had been placed there. She considered how many characters would fit in that space and what kind of identifier would have been used. She set the document down. She looked at Carver. He looked back with the unhurried steadiness of a man who had learned to give people the time they needed because he had learned what happened when you did not. "The budget session on March 14th, she said. "Who was present?" "The committee's attendance record for that date is public," Carver said. "Warren Langdon was listed as present and voting. The session ran from 2:15 to 6:40 in the afternoon. The extraction order had been delayed from 1400 hours. 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The delay had lasted 40 minutes until 1440, which was 25 minutes into Warren Langdon's budget session. After which the order came through and Mara had gone back in, and Garrett Wren had been down for 31 minutes in a position that made the outcome she brought home a foregone conclusion before she started moving. She had known the broad shape of this for 9 years. She had not had the document. "The redaction," she said, "covers what I believe it covers," Carver said. "I can't prove that yet. But the date matches, the session matches, and the language about civilian authorization is consistent with the kind of chain of command that forms when a budget office controls operational resource allocation, which happens more often than people realize and less often than it should." He reached across and turned the document back toward himself without closing the folder. "I've done the part of this that belongs to me," he said. "I can put this in front of the right people through the right channels. What happens after that is outside my control, and I won't make you promises about it." Mara was quiet. Outside the diner window, Clearwater carried on. Cars at the light, a woman pushing a stroller, a delivery truck double parked in front of a hardware store. The things that kept happening, because most things kept happening, regardless of what was happening in the rooms they moved past. "He put his statement out this morning," she said. "Yes." "The behavioral discharge language." "Yes." She looked at the window. October light in Idaho did not soften things or romanticize them. It showed you exactly what was in front of you and made no apologies. "I've known for 9 years, she said. She did not make it a complete sentence, and she did not try to. Carver said nothing. "I stayed in after Vularoy, 3 more deployments. I told myself I was still useful, still close enough to the truth of it, that maybe I could reach it eventually." She paused. "That was not the real reason." Carver turned his coffee cup slowly on the table, a small patient motion. "My wife's brother served," he said, 2 tours. He came home and spent a long time being angry at things that had nothing to do with why he was actually angry, and a long time being quiet about the thing that did. He told me once that the silence was its own kind of loyalty, that if he said it out loud, he was admitting it had happened, and if he admitted that he had to decide what to do about it. Carver looked at her. He figured it out eventually. What did he decide? She said. That the right thing was usually the thing hardest to do before you did it and hardest to undo after. Mara was quiet for a moment. She reached into her bag. Her hand found the challenge coin. She set it on the table between them, not in its usual position, across from the empty chair, but in the center where they could both see it. Carver looked at it without touching it. His, she said. Carver looked at it for a long time. He pushed the folder across the table toward her. The report is a copy, he said. Keep it. He stood. He left a bill on the table for the coffee without counting the change. He buttoned his jacket. I'll be in touch, he said. I know, she said. He walked to the door and pushed through it, and the October light came in for a moment flat and clear and honest, and then the door closed, and he was gone. Mara sat at the table alone. The challenge coin was in the center of the table. The folder was in front of her. The coffee had gone slightly cold. She picked the coin up, turned it once in her fingers, the familiar weight of it, the worn edges, the specific temperature. It reached from her skin. She did not put it in her bag. She held it closed in her hand, and she looked at the folder, and she sat for a long time in the stillness of a decision that has already been made and is waiting for the person making it to catch up with themselves. She thought about Garrett Wren saying, "Hold on to that for me," in the mountain dark with his breath fogging in the cold. She thought about 9 years. She thought about what it cost to keep a silence and what it wished it to end one, and whether there was any version of the math in which those two things came out equal. They did not come out equal. They had never come out equal. She had simply been for 9 years in the process of discovering that. She opened her phone. She had researched a number 2 weeks earlier, before the restaurant, before any of this had a name. The number belonged to an independent investigative journalist based in Boise, a woman with 22 years of experience covering defense contracting and government accountability. A documented record of work that did not involve a network with a budget to protect or an advertiser to disappoint. Mara had looked her up 2 weeks ago for reasons she had not fully articulated to herself at the time. She articulated them now. She pressed call. It rang twice. "This is Mara Cole," she said when the call connected. "I have a statement I would like to give and a document I would like you to see. I can be in Boise tomorrow morning." She listened. "Yes," she said, "all of it." She ended the call. She put the coin back in her bag, not in its usual pocket, just loose where her hand would find it. She put the folder in after it. She left $20 on the table and walked out of the diner into the October afternoon. The delivery truck was still double parked. The woman with the stroller had reached the end of the block. The light at the intersection was green. For the first time in 9 years, the two things she was carrying were moving in the same direction. The Idaho State Veterans Cemetery sat 12 miles outside Boise, on a stretch of high plain where the horizon was wide and the wind moved through without obstruction, carrying the quality of open country that had no interest in making itself comfortable for the people who visited. The graves were arranged in rows with the precision that military arrangements always carried, the insistence that what mattered was not the individual stone, but the collective fact of them, the long and level truth of what this ground contained. Mara had been here once before. 9 years ago in the March cold, standing in her dress uniform, with her collarbone still fractured from the Vularoy operation. She had stood at the graveside and listened to the ceremony with the quality of attention she gave to things she needed to remember exactly, and she had remembered it exactly, and she had not come back. She found the grave without the map. Garrett Wren, Sergeant First Class. The stone was white and clean in the October morning. The wind moved across it without pausing. The sky above the cemetery was the particular blue of Idaho autumn, a blue that did not negotiate with what was beneath it. He had been 31 years old. She stood in front of the stone for a long time. The October light came through at the angle it took at mid-morning, clean and sideways, touching the white stone and making it look almost warm, which it was not. She reached into her bag. Her hand found the challenge coin. She brought it out and held it in the light for a moment and then placed it on top of the stone. She stayed close. "You told me to let it go," she said. Her voice in the wind was a private thing, not a whisper, but something that belonged to this place and not beyond it. "You said it wasn't worth what it would cost me, that the same thing would happen to someone else regardless, and the only question was whether I was going to spend the rest of my life angry about it or do something with the time I had." She looked at the coin on the stone. "You were right about most things. You were wrong about this one." The wind moved through the rows of stones with a sound that was almost nothing. "I tried it your way. 3 more deployments. I went back and told myself I was still useful, still close enough to the truth that I might eventually reach it. She touched the edge of the stone with 2 fingers. That was not the real reason. The real reason was that saying it out loud made it real in a way I could not take back. The version I had was already heavy enough. She was quiet for a while. A groundskeeper moved along a path 2 rows over unhurried, with the practiced discretion of a man who had worked in this place long enough to understand when to be visible and when to disappear. A man stood up in a restaurant last week, Mara said. No training, no advantage, no reason to think it would go well for him. He stood up because the situation required someone to, and he was the someone who happened to be there. She paused. I have been thinking about that every day since. The gap between what it cost him to stand up and what it has cost me to stay sitting down. She looked at the coin on the stone. Then she picked it up. Not because she was unable to leave it, because she understood standing there in the wind of the Idaho plain that leaving it on cold marble was not the same as giving it back. The coin was not meant for stone. It was meant for someone who could carry it forward, the way Garrett had always understood. Things were meant to be carried not as weight but as direction. She did not know yet who that person was, but she would know when she found them, because that was also something Garrett had been right about. She put the coin back in her bag. I'm going to say the thing you told me not to say, she said, because someone has to, because if I don't, the next 40 minutes belong to someone else. And I am done with that. She straightened. She turned and walked back along the path through the rows of white stones, and the wind followed her to the gate, and the noise of the road beyond it was mild and ordinary, and very far from the silence she had just left. She had a meeting in 2 hours. Patricia Haas was waiting in Boise. The journalist's name was Patricia Haas, and she had spent 22 years covering defense contracting and government accountability for outlets that had nothing to protect worth more than the story. She was 54 years old with the particular stillness of someone who had spent a career in rooms where people were deciding whether or not to tell the truth. She knew how to wait. She knew how to make the waiting feel like there was no clock running on whatever the person across from her was deciding. They met in a Boise office with a conference table, 4 chairs, and a window that looked at a parking structure. Haas had a recording device, a notepad, and a copy of the redacted report she had obtained through her own channels, which she did not explain and Mara did not ask about. Mara sat across from her and gave her statement. It took 3 hours. She described the Vuelleror Highlands operation in the detail that was not classified, which was more than most people outside the relevant agencies knew, and enough to establish the sequence that the redacted report only partially reflected. She described the delay. She described the 40 minutes in operational terms, the language of position and exposure, and what changes in a tactical situation when time is altered by that increment. She described Garrett Wren first in the flat language of after-action reports, and then she stopped using that language, and described him in the other kind, the kind that cost something to use that she had not used with anyone since the graveside 9 years ago. Haas did not interrupt. She asked 3 questions over the 3 hours, each going to the center of something Mara had left incompletely said. When it was done, Mara signed a statement confirming the accuracy of her account. She provided 3 supporting documents redacted where legitimately classified and unredacted where not. She gave contact information for Leon Carver, who had already confirmed through the precinct's legal office that he was prepared to speak on the documents he had obtained through official channels. She gave contact information for Ray Kowalski, who had responded to Haas's prior inquiry in 12 words that were not the same 12 words he had posted online, but carried the same quality of plain-spoken conviction. She walked out at 5:47 into the October dusk. She stood on the Boise sidewalk and let the city happen around her without processing it for threat or opportunity. She just stood there for a while and let herself be a person on a sidewalk in the early evening. It was not yet comfortable. It was something she could practice. Her phone buzzed. Ray Kowalski. My daughter wants to know if the woman from the restaurant is okay. I didn't know what to tell her. I figured I'd tell her the truth, which is that I think she's more okay than she's been in a long time. Sorry if I overstepped. She read it twice, then she typed, You didn't overstep. Tell her I said thank you for asking. She put her phone away and walked to her car. The dusk had the quality of dusk in October light, going out of things slowly and completely. She thought about Garrett Wren's coin in her bag, and she thought about the weight of not having it in its usual pocket, which was not physically different but felt different. The way things feel when something long held in a specific place is finally in motion towards somewhere else. She thought it felt like something ending. She thought it also felt in a quieter register like something beginning. What happened after is harder to make dramatic because what happened after was mostly slow and procedural, conducted in rooms that looked nothing like the rooms people imagined when they thought about justice by people who looked nothing like movie people through processes that moved at the speed of institutions, which was to say, very slowly and then all at once. Patricia Haas published her investigation 7 weeks after their meeting in Boise. It ran in 2 parts. The first established the sequence of events surrounding the Vuilleror Highlands operation and the 40-minute delay, drawing on the documents Leon Carver had provided through official channels, the testimony of 4 additional sources Haas had developed independently, and Mara's account attributed by name at Mara's explicit request. The second part traced the authorization chain for the budget session that had run concurrently with the delay, establishing through public records the specific votes cast the specific members present, and the specific timeline that placed Warren Langdon in committee while the extraction order waited on someone's desk in a chain of command that connected the civilian budget office to the operational approval process in ways that most Americans did not know existed and that several officials had spent 9 years ensuring remained unexplored. The documents were not fabricated. The timeline was not speculative. The sourcing was attributed and verifiable. Haas had spent 22 years building the kind of credibility that made her work difficult to dismiss on procedural grounds, and Warren Langdon's office attempted every procedural ground available and found none sufficient. The first part was shared 140,000 times in 48 hours. The second was picked up by 7 major outlets within a day of publication. A Senate Oversight Committee announced an inquiry within the week. 2 of Langdon's colleagues on the Defense Appropriations Committee issued statements calling for cooperation with the inquiry. A third colleague who had served on the same committee for 16 years and had his own reasons for wanting this particular story fully told, issued a statement that went further. Warren Langdon resigned his Senate seat on a Thursday morning 11 weeks after the night at Ashford Grill. His statement cited health concerns and the desire to spend more time with his family. 4 sentences. The minimum viable product of a public departure containing nothing that acknowledged anything, which was the one thing in it that was entirely honest, because acknowledging things had never been a practice he had developed, and it was too late to start now. Brett Langdon received a sentence of 6 months in a county facility, the outcome of a plea arrangement that reflected the evidence, the witnesses, the footage viewed by 32 million people across platforms, and the specific disadvantage of having a father whose name had become in the preceding weeks a liability rather than an asset. He served the sentence. He was released. He lived afterward in the diminishment of a man whose primary identity had been his father's name, and whose father's name now meant something it had not meant before. He flinched when people touched his wrist. He did not approach women in restaurants. These were small things. They were not nothing. Derek Solt received a lesser charge in community service. Marcus Webb received a suspended sentence. Neither of them was a story anyone followed for long because they had never been the story. Ray Kowalski was a story briefly, and then because he genuinely did not want to be one, he receded from it in the way of people who are not seeking the attention that finds them. He was interviewed once by Patricia Haas for the sidebar of the second part of her investigation. He said he had stood up because his father had told him a long time ago that the measure of a man was not what he was capable of, but what he did with that capability when someone needed it. He said he had not been thinking about that at the time. He had just stood up. He thought that was probably how it worked with most things that mattered. He went back to his ordinary life. His youngest daughter thought he was the most interesting person she knew. He was not entirely sure he deserved that assessment, but he did not argue with a 7-year-old because 7-year-olds were right about more than adults generally credited. The Cole Valor Grant was announced through a legal foundation established in Boise. Its funding listed as a private endowment, its administrator, a law firm with no visible connection to anyone whose name had recently been in any news cycle. The grant was designed to support female candidates pursuing special operations training who demonstrated the capability and commitment the selection process required, but whose financial circumstances made the path to candidacy prohibitive. The announcement was modest. A press release through the foundation, a brief description of the eligibility criteria and the application process. No names, no narrative, no explanation of why the fund existed, because the explanation was private, and the people who needed to understand it did not need to read it in a press release. The first application arrived 11 days after the announcement. The applicant was Nora Wren. She was 22 years old. She had grown up in rural Pennsylvania, a small town that had been her father's hometown before it became hers, and she had been living in a rented room in Idaho for the past 8 months while she worked 2 jobs and prepared for the candidacy application process she had been building toward for 18 months without the resources the grant was designed to provide. Her qualifications were specific and documented. Her physical testing scores were in the 93rd percentile. Her background investigation was clean. Her 3 letters of recommendation were unanimous in their assessment and unanimous in the language they reached for independently of one another, which was that Nora Wren had the thing that could not be taught, which was the understanding that service was not something that happened to you, but something you chose every day before anything else. Her personal statement was 4 paragraphs. The first described her interest in special operations training in the practical language of someone who had thought carefully about what she was asking for and why. The second described her financial situation with the directness of someone who had been managing difficulty long enough to have stopped being embarrassed by it. The third described her father. She wrote that Sergeant First Class Garrett Wren had explained service to her in terms she could understand when she was young and had re-explained it in more complicated terms as she got older, and that the explanation had grown with her in the way that true things grew. She wrote that the last time she had seen him, 2 days before the Vularoy Highlands operation, he had talked about someone he served with. A woman who had his complete and unreserved professional respect, which was something he did not give easily or without reason. He had told his daughter that if anything happened, if the situation ever came to the place where someone had to make the hard call, it would be that person who made it. She will do the right thing, he had said. She always does. The fourth paragraph said that she did not know what had happened to that woman, or where she was, or what life she had built after the uniform. She said she hoped wherever that life was, it was a good one. She said she was applying for this grant because she wanted to be the kind of person her father had described. Not the kind who was capable, the kind who did. The application was forwarded to a private review address that resolved to an email account Mara accessed from her apartment in Clearwater. She read the application on a Saturday morning. She read it once quickly for structure and content. Then she set her coffee down and read it again slowly from the beginning with the full weight of her attention. She read the third paragraph 3 times. She will do the right thing. She always does. Garrett Wren had said this to his 13-year-old daughter 2 days before the morning in the mountain dark when he had pressed a challenge coin into Mara's palm and said, "Hold on to that for me." He had said it with the matter-of-fact confidence of someone not predicting but reporting the same voice he used to describe things that were already settled and true. Mara sat at her kitchen table with the application on the screen and no sound in the apartment except the Saturday morning quiet of a building going about its unhurried business, and she did not move for a long time. The challenge coin was in her bag across the room, loose in the main compartment where her hand would find it. Not in its usual pocket. She had not put it back. She looked at the bag. She thought about the person who had been 13 years old on the day of the Vularoy Highlands operation, who had grown up carrying the shape of an unfinished thing, who had applied for a grant at a foundation with no visible connection to anyone, and written 4 paragraphs that closed a loop Mara had been circling for 9 years. She opened the email application and typed 2 sentences to the foundation's administrator. "Nora Wren is approved. Please process the full grant immediately." She closed the laptop. She got her jacket. She was going to Boise. She had a first session to prepare, and she had something to give to someone who had been waiting for it without knowing she was waiting, and it was time. Sentinel Shield opened it on a Wednesday morning in the second week of November in a rented facility on the south side of Boise that had been a community center in a previous life and had the quality of spaces used for many purposes, which was a neutral, institutional warmth. Nothing specific on the walls, portable fixtures, correcting the fluorescent overhead lighting, floors that had absorbed enough movement over the years to feel inhabited. Mara had spent 3 weeks building the program without announcing it. No press release for Sentinel Shield. A filing with the state, a notice in the relevant professional channels, and a phone call to each of the 12 women in the first cohort. Those calls were not long. She told each woman what the program was, what it required, what it offered, and what the timeline looked like. She answered every question directly. She did not describe what had happened at Ashford Grill. If any of the 12 women had seen the footage, they did not mention it. She did not ask. The first session began at 7 in the morning. 12 women ages 19 to 31 in workout clothes in the particular quiet of people who have arrived somewhere new and are not yet certain what to make of it. Mara stood at the front of the room and looked at them. She was aware from long practice of the 2 exits behind her and to her left. She was standing in the corner of the room, which was not where an instructor conventionally stood. She had never stood conventionally anywhere, and she did not intend to start. She did not give a speech. She told them the schedule. She told them the standard they were working toward. She told them what the first week would require in terms of time and effort and the specific willingness to be wrong in front of other people repeatedly, which was something training demanded and which was harder for some people than the physical requirements. Then one of the women in the back row raised her hand. She was 22 years old, sitting with the watchful, paying close attention quality of someone who had been reading the rooms since she was old enough to understand that rooms required reading. She had grown up in a Pennsylvania town where people kept their opinions loud and their doors unlocked and their pot roast on the stove every Sunday. She had her father's eyes, which were gray adjacent in certain light, and her father's way of sitting in a space as though she already knew where the exits were. "How do you stay calm," she said, "when everything is going wrong at once? How do you keep from panicking?" The room was quiet. 11 other women were listening with the slightly heightened attention of people who had also wanted to ask this question and were glad someone had. Mara looked at her for a moment. She thought about the question the way she thought about all questions that were really asking something else, which was by finding what was underneath the words. "You don't stay calm," she said. "Calm is not the goal. Calm is the result. What you are actually really doing is running the list. You are assessing what is in front of you, identifying what you can control and what you cannot, and making your decision based on what is actually there rather than what you are afraid might be there." She paused. "Fear is information. It tells you something real. The problem is that it tends to deliver everything at once, and everything at once is too much to act on. So you slow it down. You take the information in sequence. You make the first decision, then the next one." She looked at the woman in the back row who was listening with the focused, total attention of someone who was going to remember exactly what was said. "It gets easier," Mara said. "Not because you get less afraid, because you get better at the list." The woman nodded. After the session ended, when the 11 other women had dispersed into the November morning and the facility was returning to its quiet, she came to the front of the room. She walked with the economy of movement that was partly natural and partly already beginning to be trained, the walk of someone who knew where her feet were. She stopped at a respectful distance and looked at Mara with those gray adjacent eyes that made something catch in Mara's chest for a moment, because they were not quite Garrett's eyes, but they carried the same quality in certain light, the clear and patient quality of someone who looked at a thing until they understood it. "My father talked about someone he served with," Nora Wren said. She said it plainly without circling it, the way someone walked directly to a thing they had been walking toward for a long time. "I think I'm looking at her." Mara was quiet. Nora did not fill the quiet. She waited in it with the patience of someone who understood that silence between two people was not always a problem requiring solution. "He was the best soldier I ever served with," Mara said finally. "He was the best person. Those are not always the same thing. With him, they were." Nora received this with the steadiness of someone who had been holding the weight of her father's memory for 9 years and knew how. "I know," she said simply. They stood for a moment in the quiet of the emptied room. Mara reached into her bag. Her hand found the challenge coin the way it had always found it, without looking by the memory of where it was and what it weighed. She brought it out and held it in the space between them. The November light from the high windows caught at once a brief silver reflection, and then the light moved on. "He gave this to me the morning of the Volaror operation," Mara said. "He told me to hold on to it for him." She looked at the coin in her open hand. "I spent 9 years understanding that to mean hold on to it in place of him. I was wrong about that. He meant hold on to it until you find the right person to give it to." Nora looked at the coin in Mara's outstretched hand. She looked at it the way you looked at something you had heard described for so long that the real version required a moment to become real. She took it. She held it in both hands, not turning it, not examining it, just holding it with the stillness of someone who understood what had been placed in her and was deciding how to carry it. "Thank you," she said, her voice was steady, "for coming back for it, eventually." She closed her hand around the coin. She shifted her bag onto her shoulder. She walked to the exit and did not look back, which was the right thing to do, which was what you did when you were ready to carry something forward instead of backward. Mara watched her go. The room was very quiet, the good kind. The following morning, Mara Cole woke at 5:40, which was when she had always woken and likely always would. She lay in the thin light of her Clearwater apartment and listened to the building around her, doing nothing in particular, which was the sound of ordinary lives moving at their ordinary pace, and she let it be what it was. She made coffee. She stood at the kitchen window and watched Clearwater come into its morning. Gradual, undramatic. A car, a dog ahead of its owner on the sidewalk, moving with the purposeful confidence of an animal that knew exactly where it was going. The delivery truck that parked in the same spot every Thursday and always blocked the fire lane and never got a ticket. She sat at the kitchen table. She wrapped both hands around the cup and looked at the surface of the table in front of her. The table was empty, not in the way it had been empty before, which was the emptiness of a space waiting to be occupied by something that kept the past present and the coin in its place across from the chair where no one sat. Just empty. The clean, plain emptiness of a table in the morning, in an apartment that was becoming, slowly and without ceremony, a place where someone lived. She drank her coffee. She thought about Nora Wren's hand closing around the coin, the steadiness of it, the way she had walked out without looking back, carrying it forward instead of backward, which was what Garrett had always understood it was for. She thought about the empty place in her bag where the coin had lived for 9 years, the specific absence of it, how the bag had felt lighter on the drive home from Boise, and how lighter was not the same thing as less. She looked at the window. The dog had rounded the corner. The delivery truck's driver was climbing out with a clipboard. The morning light had the honest, flat quality of November in Idaho, showing you exactly what was in front of you, without commentary or softening. She thought briefly about the 2 exits in this apartment, front door and window. She noted them and let the information pass through without lodging anywhere. Old habit. She was working on the lodging part. She finished her coffee. She sat for a while longer in the quiet of the morning, which was her quiet now in her kitchen, in her life on the ordinary side of something that had not yet finished becoming whatever it was going to be. Outside, the delivery truck pulled back into traffic. The sidewalk cleared and then filled again with someone new. The light moved the way November light moved, without drama, illuminating each thing in its turn and then moving on to the next. There is a question that Leon Carver would later say he wished someone had asked aloud in the room that night at Ashford Grill, in the silence after the 17 seconds when 40 people sat with forks suspended and phones raised, and their understanding of what they had witnessed still forming itself into something they could hold. He asks it now when people ask him what the most interesting case he ever walked into was. He always corrects them. It was not a case, he says. It was a dinner, and it was not interesting. It was true. The question is this: how many Garrett Wrens are still waiting for someone to say the thing they were told not to say? Waiting for someone to stand up from the adjacent table knowing nothing, guarantees it goes well, knowing it might cost something real, and standing up anyway because the situation required someone, and they were the someone who happened to be there. Waiting for the kind of person who understands that the coin was never meant for the stone. That direction is not the same thing as wait, that the difference between holding on and letting go is knowing which one serves the people still living. How many are waiting for someone who has already paid the full cost of waiting long enough and has finally, at the end of 14 years and one quiet dinner, stopped? Mara Cole put her cup in the sink. She got her jacket from the hook by the door. She picked up her bag, adjusted the strap to the length she had always used, and opened the door to the November morning. The air came in cold and clean and carrying the specific smell of November in Idaho, which was a smell without sentiment, the smell of a season that knew what it was. She stepped out. She did not check the position of the exits before she left. She was working on that, and she was getting better.